Excellent. So yes, so also this is an important information. This session will be recorded and you will also receive the recording afterwards. But first of all, I would like to welcome you all to today's session, Successful Grant Preparation with Emma Murda from The Wheel. She's an expert on the topic, and maybe you joined also the first episode of this series where we had like the grounds and the basics of grant writing. I will share that webinar in the chat later on. So this is the second episode of this event series. We will actually do a deep dive together with Emma. What I told you before is this session is recorded. We will share the recording. We will also share all slides and other important information, resources, materials that we mentioned here today in a follow-up email afterwards. And I mentioned that before, if you have a question while we present and deliver content, you're very welcome to put all your questions in the Q&A box that you find in the menu below. But let's have a look what awaits us today. So first of all, we will have a quick Menti. These are only 3 questions just to see how familiar you are already with grant writing and what is like maybe the most difficult part for you when writing a grant application. Then Emma is telling you more about the first step in the whole process, and this is about designing your project concept. Then we have a quick Q&A, so answering the first questions all around this aspect of grant writing. Then in the second step, Emma will share with us her tips and tricks on maximizing points when it comes to writing funding applications for EU projects. We have another Q&A in case there are more questions, and we haven't answered all your questions. And that's it. Then we wrap it up and we will share more supports also from our side here at Access Europe. These should be 90 minutes in total. And as I mentioned, we start with a very quick Menti poll. So you can either scan this code here, the QR code, or you click on the link that Emma just shared in the chat. So you have 2 possibilities. You scan with your phone this QR code, or you click on the link. I will stop sharing my screen in a second and we'll open the Menti so that we can see. These questions are around your level of experience of writing grant applications, but also what is like your most important difficulties when it comes to this topic, and also what kind of supports would you need. So I stop sharing my screen now to be able to share with you the results of our very short poll. Let me do that here. Okay. So here we go. First of all, we were asking, how much experience do you have with writing grant applications? Most of you say a fair amount. So, okay, so you're in the middle of it. That's actually great, because we had like the first event, part of the event series we told you about, which was kind of for beginners, so how to start. And this is now like for the second part, this is about like the really nitty gritty and like, okay, how can I actually up my experience around this whole topic? Some have none, which is also good. You will definitely learn lots here today, because we will share also some basic tips and tricks around that. And then 10 have extensive experience with writing funding applications, writing grant applications. That's very interesting for us to know. Now we have the second question, and we're really interested in knowing which state of grant preparation you find most challenging. So is it maybe about the start? So designing a competitive project concept? Is it rather about to align the proposal, the texts to the funder priorities? Is it maybe around creating a budget and all the financial templates? Is it maybe about writing impact narratives? So the whole narrative around it, the story, developing a good narrative actually for your project? Or is this part the most challenging when it's about reporting, monitoring, compliance, so all the post-award past the project, after the project, what's happening. So which stage of the grant preparation you actually find most challenging? And what I see here now is that most of you say it's actually the budget. Yes, very understandable. I find that myself as well. And it is also aligning proposals with funder priorities. Okay, this is a very interesting point. I see also writing the impact narrative, which is kind of connected to the funder priorities. I give you one more second just to cast your vote here on this question. That is really interesting for us also to see. And now the last one is an open question. What kind of support would you need to maximize your grant writing? This is also interesting for us if we would probably do a third edition of this event series to see, okay, what else could we provide that you would need? What else, like what topic? We saw that right now, budget and finances. This is a really challenging aspect of writing actually a grant application. So maybe we would focus on that. And this is an open question. You should be able to send your questions here. Maybe you're not. Ah, there it is. Okay, so yeah. The budget, we had that budgeting exactly. Focus, what you would also need is support is feedback. Oh yeah, feedback to applications. I can imagine that. Word count, very important topic, absolutely. To limiting yourself actually and not be able to like write as much as you want. Choosing the correct grant, very interesting. We can help you with that, definitely here at Access Europe. Templates is always an important aspect of that. What else do we have here? Engaging storytelling. Yeah, that was like an aspect that we had before. So like having maybe a focus on storytelling, that could be also a very interesting event or a webinar that we could design. Donor scoring systems, absolutely. And that also differs actually from fund to fund. So this is very interesting for us to see. We will get back to this. So we will take all of this into consideration if we're planning new events for the next year, for 2026, to see, okay, what could we focus on next? Thanks so much for taking part in this very short survey and poll. I stop sharing my screen now and would hand over to Emma.
Great, thank you very much for that. That was actually really interesting for me as well, because we haven't asked that many questions before. We always do like a little poll or something, but that was, I took a few screenshots there because there was lots to learn for future trainings. For now though, I'm gonna just maybe, Christina, you can give me a thumbs up if you can see my slides, okay?
Yes, we see your slides.
Great stuff. Well, look, thanks very much, everybody, for joining us. I saw some familiar names and some new names in the chat there as people were saying hello. So it's great to have such a big crowd in today. We have 93 people in. So hopefully we can touch on some interesting and useful bits for everybody. I was also interested to see the level of experience there. I think that's really important to bear in mind. I've said this at the top of the last training that we did, and I say it on top of every training that I do around funding. Anything to do with grants and grant applications is very much an art, not a science. There is no one way of doing it. There's no, sole truth when it comes to how to go about putting together grant applications. It's very much, everything that I present and my various trainings that I do are just based on trial and error and lots of experience of writing grants. But similarly, like everybody in the room, you will have your own kind of tips and tricks and learnings that you've picked up over the years. So hopefully we'll have time at the end for people to share their own ideas, or if you think of anything as I'm going along and you want to add your own experience or learning, please do put it in the chat. Because I think that'll be really useful. Like there's a great breadth of experience in the room, so why not share it? And then at the end, hopefully we'll have time for plenty of Q&A. So I know that Christina will kind of keep an eye on the chat. So if there's anything kind of basic questions as we go along. We'll hopefully be able to answer them as we go. So things like, for example, are you going to receive the slides? Yes, absolutely. You will receive the slides. You will receive the recording. Anything I reference in, sometimes I reference templates and things like that. So anything that I reference in the training, you will receive in a follow-up. So there's no need to try and scribble down loads of notes or anything. You will receive all of the materials afterwards. But also if there's any other kind of clarifying things that you need to ask as you go along, just pop them in the chat, and then we'll hopefully have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So as Christina said, my name's Emma Murta. I'm the Director of Development and Member Services at The Wheel. So that involves lots and lots of grant preparation, lucky me. This is a follow-on training from a previous one that we've done and that I've done quite a few times, which is tips and tricks for grant writing, essentially. So we will link to that. You can actually watch back that previous session if you see the link below there. So when you receive the slides, you'll be able to click through to that link and watch the previous session if you like, but it's not essential to have seen that session in order to get stuff out of this one. I may refer back to it every now and again. Please feel free to go back and watch it if you like, but it's not absolutely essential. This can also be kind of a standalone training. As Christina also mentioned, there'll be a few things I'll touch on, things like designing your concept, using scoring criteria to your advantage, maximising points when answering questions. And I've also added in, unbeknownst to Christina at the last minute, I added in a few budget tips as well. So that's a new bit that we'll touch on today. So I'll put them in at the end. Yeah, just looking at some of the feedback of, you know, the word cloud that we got there, it was interesting because some of the things are touched on in these trainings. So for example, we'll have a look at an example of a good answer, kind of an answer that maximizes points. So I think that was one of the things that came up, is to have a look at some successful examples and examples where points were maximized and things like that. And in terms of like just good practice in writing, so like how to, you know, things like wording and vocabulary came up and stuff like that. That's covered, you know, I talk a little bit about that in some of the tips and the tricks of the last one. So hopefully between these two webinars, we'll hit on quite a few bits, but we'll certainly take away that feedback and think about maybe there's a follow-up session as well. Another, I will get stuck in very quickly, but just another thing is this webinar is being coordinated through Access Europe, which is our EU funding advice service. I will look at some examples of, you know, I'll use EU funding application questions as examples and things like that, and we can look at EU funding as a lens. But everything I described today applies to all types of grants. It's not unique to EU funding. And in general, EU funding is a good one to use as an example, because if you can do that one, you can kind of do any of them. So it's a good standard to perform to. But I think, is that all my caveats? I hope so. If I think of any more, I'll add them in. But let's get started anyway, the time being. So we're going to look at designing your project concept. So in the last session, we talked a lot about the things you can do to get ready for grants, because for a lot of people, and I'm sure, look, we've all had it, I still have it to this day, even though I've been writing grants for years and years and years, it's the last minute panic, it's the stress of the deadline that actually makes it more the most difficult thing about writing grants. So in the last session, we really focused on all of the things you can do ahead of time to get yourself grant ready, so that when an opportunity does come up, you're ready to act and to try and take some of that stress out of the whole process. So that was the focus of the last session. Now we're kind of imagining that you've done all your grant readiness stuff and you're ready to actually, you've identified an opportunity, and now you actually have to design your project. So we're kind of looking that one step beyond. And a lot of this, many of you will have heard about the theory of change model. People also talk about logic models, things like that. But essentially this focuses, when we're talking about designing a project, it's all about, if you look at the last point there, it's all about where you are, being the problematic point A. The situation as it is now is not great for whatever reason. It's not good enough. There's not enough support or services or whatever. But you can imagine this better situation at point B, where you do have the services, you do have the resources, and it's all about plotting how do you get from point A to point B. So it's about getting from the problematic point A to the better situation at point B. And a lot of the time, people have no problem imagining point B. They can imagine all the things about how, oh, if we only had this and if we only had that, and things would be so much better if we could just have this kind of resourcing, or if we just had this extra capacity or whatever. So they're very good at imagining the point B, but they're not very good at the missing middle, the plotting of mapping from how do you get to where you are, from where you are now to where you want to be. So the theory of change focuses on mapping out or filling in what has often been described as the missing middle between what a project does, all of its activities, all the things that it's intended to do, and how it gets to the long term, the point B, the desired goal at the end of it all. So the way the theory of change works, you start by kind of identifying that long-term goal. So what it is that you want to achieve, and then you kind of reverse engineer it, right? What are all the steps we need to do to get to that point? So you work back from these to identify all the conditions or outcomes that must be in place for the goal or goals to occur. So that's a little bit complicated, but we look at a couple of examples, different examples of how you can do that now. So when we think about the missing middle, like this is, like I said, this is the bit, being able to imagine point B is common. We can all imagine how things might get better. It's also, you know, ideas. Often people talk to me and they have great ideas, and that's fantastic. And our sector is, you know, full of great ideas and people with great vision, and that's great. But it's the missing middle. It's how to get there. It's the project design and the how rigorous and how comprehensive that project design is that really trips people up. We have to kind of get away from the idea that ideas alone are enough. Ideas are never enough. Lots and lots of people have ideas. It's the execution, it's the project design, it's the missing middle of how to get to that ideal point that is missing, and that's the tricky part. So in things to consider when we're talking about the missing middle, so what are the key steps needed? So, you know, we're going to look at a project example now soon that will outline this. I just came up with like a fictional project example. But whenever you're trying to get to the point B, there is always some kind of steps involved in getting there. Maybe there's some consultation that needs to be done, some research. Maybe you need to do a needs analysis or something like that. And then from there, maybe you need to pilot something. You know, you've developed something new in order to meet a need, and you need to test it out. And then you need to evaluate it to see, did that actually work? And then you need to mainstream it or finalize it and publish it and disseminate it and all that kind of stuff. So there's always some kinds of steps involved in how to get, and that usually focuses around outputs, so things you produce, activities, i.e. things you do, or events, like things where you meet with people, with stakeholders, or you launch something or disseminate something. So there's what are the key steps that are needed? How will you implement it on time, on budget, and as promised? And this is one of the key areas. People get so caught up in their idea and how great their idea is. And like, that's very understandable, because the idea is the exciting part. The boring bit is the money and the time frame and, you know, the quality management and all of that stuff that isn't as fun to think about or write about, but is unfortunately absolutely necessary. As in, if you could have the best idea in the whole world, but if you can't convince the funder that you can do it on time and on budget and to a quality that you promised that you would deliver, then they're not going to fund you. Why would they? You know, that's the thing, that they need to feel reassured that you have all of the structures in place, that you have all of the kind of professionalism in place to manage their money well. Now, before I go any further, just a caveat. Obviously, grants can be, you know, massive. Like, it can be everything from a couple of €1,000 from your local council right up to hundreds of thousands of euro from the EU or something like that. So obviously, you know, depending on the scale of the grant, you know, the scale of what's expected from you, from the funder will adjust. You know, so if you're just going for a couple of €1,000 for a little grant, you don't need to stress yourself too much about all of this different stuff, the project management and all of this stuff. Like, absolutely, you should have a good project plan in place and you should have it well planned out. But, you know, it's certainly different from if you're requesting hundreds of thousands of euro off a big institution like the EU. So obviously, with everything that I say today, including this project management, including the steps and everything else that we'll cover, adjust it in your head for the scale of grants that you're going to be going for. But anyway, the project management piece is important. It's all around, can you be trusted to actually deliver on this idea? Have you thought of all of the considerations that need to be taken into account? How will you know that it's working? So this is your impact, your evaluation, your quality, your KPIs. A lot of people really shy away from setting KPIs and budgets. They're a bit afraid to give themselves a rod to be beaten with later, but it is absolutely essential. I mentioned it in the previous training that I did. If you say, oh, we're going to reach people with this activity, well, how many people? Is it one person? Is it two people? Or is it 100 people? Like, from the funder's perspective, how do they know that it's going to be good value for money or not if you don't give them KPIs, if you don't give them some kind of criteria in which through which you're going to measure your impact and your quality and things like that. So you need to think about this. This is also really important, and for yourself as well. Like, we all come up with ideas and interventions, but if we don't know that they're working, how do we know where to be directing all of our effort and our work and everything like that? How will you make sure the right people are on board? So again, depending on this, if it's a very small grant, it might be absolutely fine for you just to deliver it in-house and that's it. But if you're doing something a little bit more ambitious, and this is a larger project, more often than not, it's not going to be just you. You need buy-in from other people. You might need buy-in from other organizations, from your beneficiaries, from your service users, from your community, but you also might need buy-in from other funders or from policymakers, for example, who can maybe take the learnings from your projects and implement them in order to receive real change, or to affect real change, I should say. So in general, there will be some kind of stakeholders, some kind of interested parties that are relevant to your project, and you should consider them. They're either people who you need their buy-in, or people who can help you maximize the outputs of your projects and implement like real change and make it as impactful as possible. And how will you make sure people know about it? So this is also very important. Most funders feel strongly about this. They want to see visibility for their investment. They don't want it to live and die within your organization. Again, if it's very small, this might not apply, but for any kind of larger grants, they want to see some kind of visibility. They want to see that you're sharing your learnings, you're sharing the outputs, that it's made available, that it's, because that then goes on to potentially increase the impact even more. Because if it's something that you've developed in your organization and has worked really well, maybe you can share it with other organizations and they can also adopt it. So these are all the things. This is basically all the components of a project as well, if you want to use it as a bit of a cheat sheet. There's outputs, activities, events. There's the project management that underpins it all. There's the impact, evaluation, quality, KPIs, all of that area. There's stakeholder management, and there's dissemination. Those are the pieces of a project. And these are all the things you need to consider in order to fill in that missing middle. This is an example of the theory of change. Now, this one I always think is a little bit complicated, but this is an example of a theory of change model. So you start at the end there in terms of what is the problem you're trying to solve. Then you go into who is your key audience. So this is very important. I've talked to people, I'll use an example of a project later on where we talk about children as the target group, but I would always say children are never a target group. Like, what kind of children? Are we talking about children with lots of opportunities or children with fewer opportunities? Are we talking about 8-month-olds or 18-year-olds? Are we talking about children here in Ireland or abroad? Are we talking about children in deaf schools? Are we talking about children with special needs? It's never specific enough. You need to really hone in, because obviously if we think about all those different types of children, whether they're 1-year-old or 18 years old, completely different approaches needed. So, you have to really hone in, try to avoid saying things like children or people experiencing homelessness or, members of the community. Always try and hone in on exactly who it is you're trying to reach, because that shows that you've really thought about the profile of the person and you've really tailored your project to be as impactful as possible to your specific audience. So who is your audience, and hone in specifically. We'll look at an example of it soon. What is your entry point to reaching your key audience? So how are you going to reach them? For many of you, you work directly with them every day anyway, so that's how you're going to to reach them, and that's fine. But for some people, again, we look at an example soon where we're looking at a program for children, and if you're assuming that you're going to reach them via schools, like you're going to reach them within the school program, and that's how you're going to access your target group, that's a big assumption to make. So you need to think about how sure that entry point is. So we'll look at that now in a minute as well. So what steps are needed to bring about the change? And they give 3 examples here of 3 steps. There might be many, many steps, but you could start with the 3 steps there. And how do you measure the impact of that change? How do you measure the effectiveness of that step? And then what are the wider benefits to your work for each step? Like, is it just on its own, or is there has to be some kind of wider impact of it? And then how does that all lead into what the long-term change you see as your goal? So this is an example. I always feel this is a bit complicated, particularly when you're first at that kind of project concepts. Maybe later in the process you can come to this thing. I'll look at a simpler one now in a minute that I think is very handy for when you're first conceptualizing projects. But one of the things that I think is really important is, number one, this provides a nice structure. And number 2, you'll notice that underneath it says things like key assumptions all along until the very end, which is stakeholders. So cutting to the end, long-term change, actual change in society and in communities is rarely achieved alone. I mentioned that already. Usually you need the buy-in of policymakers, you need the buy-in of other funders, you need the buy-in of the community itself, you need the buy-in of other like-minded organizations in order to work together to achieve real change. So that's why when it comes to the long-term change, you really need to think about what stakeholders are necessary to achieve that. Who else has a stake in this, and who else can help you achieve this long-term vision and impact that it is you want to achieve. But in every other step of the thing, I think the really important thing they ask is around key assumptions. So in the last training, we talked about the who, what, when, why, where, all those questions. But essentially, it's the same thing as key assumptions. So you have to always, this is around basing your project in evidence and in some kind of, I suppose, reality, and ensuring that what you're doing is realistic. So what is the problem that you were trying to solve? Now, there might be you shouldn't really be making too many assumptions here, because you should know very clearly what the problem is you're trying to solve. Again, we'll look at an example in a moment that'll provide, that'll show how you can justify that. But, at this point, your assumptions should be based in evidence. It should be, well, we know this is a problem because of the results of X survey, and because Y policy has highlighted it as an issue, and because this research indicates that if this continues, it'll be bad for a number of reasons. So you should have some kind of evidence there. So always be thinking, am I assuming something here? Like, am I making an assumption here? And if I am making an assumption, is that assumption based on evidence, or is it based on my own bias or my own goals, or whatever it is? Is it based in me, or is it based in evidence? And you should always be questioning those assumptions. Similarly with your key audience, if you're making an assumption based on what that audience really, you think the audience needs, and you haven't engaged with them, or you're making an assumption about who needs what and how they need it, you have to question that. You have to think, am I making an assumption here, or am I 100% confident that this is the right intervention for the right audience? Same again with the entry point. If you're assuming that you'll be able to just go into schools and reach children in order to introduce this intervention, whatever it is, that's potentially a dangerous assumption. Like, what if the schools don't allow you in? What if they're already full of programs? What if the program isn't appropriate? So again, if you're making an assumption there, obviously the safer thing to do would be to have that buy-in before you even make the application, to have already engaged with them and to have already figured out, how it's going to work, and make sure that what you're proposing works for them. Because otherwise you're making a potentially dangerous assumption that if it doesn't come to pass, like if it doesn't work out the way you're assuming, it could potentially derail the whole project. So this is the dangers of the assumptions. And then similarly, what steps are needed to bring about change? You're potentially making assumptions there around what will work, what won't work, what these people need, what they don't need. And similarly, then when it comes to the measurable effect and the wider benefits, there'll always be some assumptions made there. So look, there's, we wouldn't do anything if we didn't make some assumptions. Like, there's obviously key to any project is that there's an assumption, there's an idea here that this is something that could work. So it's not that you're going to eliminate all assumptions that you might make, but you want to, in as much as possible, make sure that you're not assuming and that you're basing it on evidence, and that where there is some assumptions that have been made because you just had to kind of make a leap of faith, or you had to propose something, sometimes there has to be a risk made to see if something will work. Where that is the case, that it's carefully mitigated and it's carefully considered. Because there are, from a funder's perspective, if they see lots of unaddressed assumptions that this is a problem to begin with, assumptions that this is what your audience needs, assumptions that you'll be able to get access to your target group, assumptions that you're going to be making X, Y, and Z impact, and there's no justification and there's no rooting in evidence, that doesn't fill them with a lot of confidence. And about 90% of grant writing is filling your evaluator with confidence. Now, like I said, I do think the theory of change model, I think it's really useful. I think it can be a little bit daunting when you're first designing a project concept. It's more for later on when you're putting structure on an idea. This is the much more basic, like baby infants version of designing a project concept, or kind of when you're first visualizing it. Later on, you'll come back and you'll flesh it all out and you'll think about all of your theory of change components. But at the very beginning, it can be useful to think about it in terms of problem, solution, and impact. And I have a very handy, very beautiful graph to demonstrate this. So the problem is, it's the same in the theory of change. Basically, it starts with the problem. What is it? What is happening that you feel needs to be addressed? And not just you feel, evidence suggests needs to be addressed. So what is it? What is the impact that it's having? And what will happen if it continues without being addressed? And at this point, you really want to focus on the gravity of the problem. Don't just assume that the evaluator, like, your area, the scale of the challenges that you're dealing with. Don't assume that the evaluator will know that. And don't assume that even if they do know it, if it's not written, if it's not justified, and if it's not evidenced in some way, they can't really give you the marks for it, because even if they know it in their own head, it's not on the paper. So you have to really think about the problem that you're addressing and really spend some time describing it. And the whole point is to really depress your evaluator, hence the little sad face there at this time. So you want to communicate the gravity of the problem that is being faced. Then you want to offer them solution. This is a little ray of light, and this is your project. Now, you're never going to, one grant is never going to completely solve something. You're not going to get one project that's going to solve homelessness or anything like that. But you are offering to solve a particular discrete issue through this program, or to be part of an overall solution. So what is your solution? What is your project? What is it? What are the objectives? And what evidence is there to support that this will work? Is it just because you have a hunch, or is it because you've done some research and there's evidence to suggest that maybe there's other models elsewhere? Like, for example, in European projects, which we're going to use as our lens today, you'd often link in with other groups throughout Europe who've maybe tried this solution before and it's worked really well, and now you can learn it and adapt it and implement it here in Ireland or whatever. So there's plenty of ways to evidence that it will work. Then there's impact, and this is the bit that gets the funder really excited, hence the very happy face, which is, what are the outcomes and the specific results that you will achieve? So this is the bit, because it's all great. Like I said, ideas are brilliant. Ideas are very exciting, but unless you can guarantee some kind of return on investment, which for grant funders is impact, that's what they're investing in. They're investing in social impact. So unless you can give them some kind of outcomes and results, they're not going to feel particularly enthused. So you want to leave them feeling really optimistic and now full of hope and excited about your project and your solution. So I did touch on this in the last one. I think it's a really good way of structuring project just to begin with. Then once you have worked out your problem, solution, impact, you might go and fill in your full theory of change things. Depends on the scale of your project. Again, if it's just a few €1,000, I wouldn't be, obviously you need to make sure it's based in evidence and make sure you have good project management in place, but you don't need to go creating something very, very elaborate or anything like that. But it can be useful, you know, to start with this and then scale up to doing a full theory of change model if that's something that helps you put structure on it. But we're going to look at an example using this problem solution impact approach as a starting point. So this is a fictional project that we just made up to as an example to show problem solution impact. So let's look at the problem. So activity levels are dropping in children and the level of isolation is increasing. I was going to say I don't really know that, but when I first looked at this, I did look that there is evidence to suggest this. So you'll see it, the sources at the bottom. There's the Eurochild report. There's this one, Getting into the Game, which is something around children in sport that had some of this data in it. And then UNICEF and Barca Foundation also had done a report indicating this. Now, you will have noticed it in your community anyway, if you're proposing this project, which is probably what sparked you to try and do something about it, but you'll root it in some kind of evidence that it's not just because I say so. It's there because the evidence says that it's there. So what impact is this having? So, and again, this is only a fictional example. This isn't comprehensive, so don't judge my project too harshly. It's just a test case. So what impact is having? It's having things like higher levels of stress and anxiety, sedentary lifestyle, poor physical fitness, adverse health outcomes, all of that. And again, there's evidence for that in those sources. Like, it's not just me saying this. There's evidence there to suggest that, yes, this is what happens when children are less active. What will happen if it continues? Again, poor mental health, poor physical health, increased child obesity, negative impact on learning and skills development. That's actually was part of this Getting into the Game report. It went in detail about how activity levels drop. Lower activity levels negatively impact children's ability to focus in school and things like that. So, right, we now have a relatively, obviously in your application, depending on how long it is and how much money you're going for it, you will have a much more rationalized, description of this problem. But this is an example of the kinds of things and how you would root it in reports or in evidence or research of some kind. So then we get on to the solution. So this is, again, just a made-up project. I'm just saying it'll be an EU-funded project that uses existing sport infrastructure in communities to launch an outreach programme with primary schools to engage/re-engage children aged 7 to 12 in sport. So that's an example. Now, again, you might go in, so children aged 7 to 12, is this children with any kinds of special needs? Are these children with fewer opportunities? Are these children with more opportunities? Can their parents, do they have disposable income that they could put into sporting program? Like, you might go deeper into it, deeper into your target group and exactly who it is that you're engaging. But for the purposes of this example, we'll just leave it at that. So what are the objectives? So we're going to increase cooperation between different sport stakeholders. We're going to remove barriers to participation. We're going to increase awareness of benefits and opportunities. And what evidence is there to support that this will work? Well, we know that sporting programs help to address the issues of lower activity in students, and we know that because of some of the evidence that I've listed there. So this is an example. What is it? What are the objectives? And what evidence is there to support that this would work? Okay. And again, I made an assumption there. I made an assumption that I could have access to primary schools. So I might not be able to do that. Like, what if I don't design my project well and I time it that, my outreach program is going to take place during the summer? Well, then that's no use. The schools aren't going to be much use to me then. Or maybe I assume that my local primary school is going to allow me access to run this program, but I haven't cleared it with them first and then they refuse me. So, we have to think about these. It comes back to the assumptions that you might have made. So look, but for the example of this project, it's a pretty straightforward solution with some objectives and with evidence to support that it works. And then you get onto the impact. So what outcomes and specific results will you achieve? So the overall objectives are things, or outcomes are things like increased mental and emotional health, increased activity levels and physical health, increased capacity for learning and development. And the results then will be like campaign materials and information, which if it's an EU project, could be translated into different languages, one cross-sectoral campaign launched in each country, a pilot program with 100 students in each country. 80% of them are going to report satisfaction with the program. 80% of them are going to report increased physical and mental health outcomes. Maybe we'll assess them before the intervention and after the intervention, and we'll measure the difference. And 80% of them are going to report increased capacity for learning. And maybe we could involve the teachers in that whole process in learning that and assessing the children before and after. There'll be a pilot study where we'll publish all of the results, where we'll analyse all of the results, and then a pilot report where we'll publish them, and maybe we'll have some kind of EU conference, so that'll be our event after the fact. So again, this is a very rough and ready example, but you can see what I mean, that you have to think about your problem, the evidence, the solution, which has evidence and has objectives, and then the impact, which has overall kind of outcomes that you want to achieve. So there's the big picture stuff, but then there's specific results with metrics. So it's not, we will reach students, we will reach 100 students in each country. Now, again, you don't have to have, obviously set metrics that are realistic for you and make sense for you and your project. But this is just an example that we're not just going to report change. We're going to set the KPI that at least 80% report change, and then we're going to measure against that. Because if you say, oh, we're going to improve the outcomes, and you only improved it by 5%, is that really success? Is that worth the evaluator investing a lot of money in that program? Whereas if you set yourself, what I always like to say is, an ambitious but achievable, don't go crazy, because you don't want to set yourself up something that you're going to fail at. But ambitious but achievable KPIs can help you win over the funder, ensure that you're going to get the impact, and they're going to get a certain level of quality and impact for what they're investing. And it helps you to know then whether your intervention is working or not. For planning projects, always use reputable sources if you can, but you can use your own research too. So for example, I'd often refer to our member survey as evidence when I'm writing grants, because it lets us know exactly what it is our members need and want. So, it can be your own research. You can have done some focus groups. You could have done a stakeholder consultation. And if you're planning a big application, like for a lot of money, you might do a little bit of this research ahead of time so that you can refer to it in your project. I always say for project design, keep it simple. So the other thing is, sometimes people can get overexcited when they see a funding opportunity and they're like, oh my God, this fits so well. There's so much we could do with this. And so they try to shove everything they've ever wanted to do into one project. And then it ends up being unwieldy and undeliverable. And it'll be unlikely to get through evaluation, because the evaluator should see straight away, like, this isn't achievable, this isn't realistic. And maybe it even doesn't make sense because it's too many disparate pieces and it doesn't fit together cohesively. But then even if you manage to get it through an evaluator somehow, it becomes this unachievable project where you end up doing everything kind of at a half effort because you just don't have time, and as a result you didn't maximize the opportunity to really do something good. So I mentioned this at the last bit. At every step you're looking at your assumptions, which is also kind of leads back to that question of who, why, what, when, where. Like, are you just assuming that these things will happen? Are you just assuming that everything will fall into place? Or have you actually thought about how you're going to do it? Why are we doing it? When is that going to happen within the project timeline? Where is it going to happen? Who's going to do it? Like, have we resourced it enough? Have we thought about this? Is it realistic? So at every step in the process, you're asking yourself questions to make sure that this is realistic, that it's achievable, and that it makes sense, within the narrative of the project. Remember, everything will also take longer than you think, particularly with projects. If you're used to doing something at operational level, when it comes to a project, particularly if you're working with external people or partners in any way, but even just doing something different outside of your everyday operational work takes longer than doing your operational work. Like, if you're not used to doing it every single day, or if it's tacked on to your mainstream work, it will take longer than you think. So bear that in mind when you're planning your projects. I talk about this in the last training as well, but I just said I'd mention it. We do provide this project concept note template. We'll circulate it with the follow-up from today's training. So this encourages you to zone in on your idea. It can be a great way of kind of writing up your project idea. And then if you do want to get buy-in from stakeholders or from partners or whatever, you can use it to reach out to them, because it describes the whole project and how it all works. So it becomes kind of a communication tool, but it encourages you to do your research as well, and to make sure that your evidence is woven in. But it can be really useful to get the project really clear in your own head before you start writing it. I would always do this step. Even if I kind of, feel like, it'll be fine, I'll just skip ahead and go straight to the grant, because the grant is going to have that really annoying habit of asking you lots of questions. And if you haven't thought about it all in advance, you end up having to kind of go back to the drawing board and change things. And then if later on the application asks you something, and then you have to go back to the beginning and change it. And it's just, if you have it all well thought out first and well, as much as you can, there'll probably still be some grant questions that are going to trip you up a bit. But as much as you can, if you have it all worked out, it means you go into the whole answering of questions much more confidently and cohesively, and it's easier to write. And there's kind of this narrative thread throughout it where you're not just making it up in reaction to the questions you've been asked. So you want to kind of avoid that, because it also is clear when that happens. When you're reading grants, you can kind of tell when there isn't that narrative thread and the person is just reacting to the individual questions. We'll just quickly check on, okay, we're okay with time. We should still have a good 15 or 20 minutes for questions at the end, but I'll just try and go a bit quicker as well.
You want to go on, or you want to take a couple of questions now? What you
think? I
think?
can take a couple of questions now.
Yeah. So just because some are actually also connected to what you just said, so maybe it makes a little bit of sense. Okay, great. So
do you have the questions there?
Yeah, I have them.
Okay, perfect. Yeah,
I already read them. Exactly.
Yeah.
So first of all, I would like to mention, because this was just a question, general question, if right now the SEUPB has some open calls. Yes, they have. They have the Changemaker funding program. Exactly. Yeah. It's paused at the moment. You see that on the website, but I also put the link to our website, which has all currently open EU funding calls. So just check that out, or reach out to us in case you have questions around single calls. Here's a question about, what are your thoughts on engaging professional grant writers in this process? Would you recommend it or not? Or also, and this is a little bit connected, does it sometimes require professional input? So architects, engineers, whatever. So did you do that before? Would you recommend that?
Okay, so I'll answer them separately. The first one around professional grant writers can be really, really useful and a great kind of addition. There's obviously, for organizations, they need to consider it, because sometimes it's quite an investment, to bring in somebody. And, a grant writer can be an amazing grant writer. They can't guarantee success. They can certainly increase your odds for success. So it is something that as an organization you really need to think about. I would say, in general, we work with lots of professional grant writers and consultants at the wheel, and we recommend a few of them. We engage them to help support with Access Europe. We engage them to help us with our own, because there's only 2 of us working in grants, and sometimes there's a lot of deadlines and you need a little bit of outside help. So I would really recommend, if you're going to do it, great, it's a good investment, but make sure they're the right person for you. Make sure that you're really working with them, and that they really take the time to understand your organization and how you work and what's realistic for you, and make sure you're working with them with the grant. I wouldn't let them have like full control. You still have to review. You still have to make sure that what they're writing, like, they can't do their job unless you give them that. So I suppose, yes, it can be a great investment. Don't see it as oh, great, we'll outsource that then and we never have to do anything with it. You still will have to buy into the process and review and make sure that the project design makes sense for your organization and your goals. I certainly managed a few projects years and years ago that were written by EU funding consultants abroad, who wrote the projects and then disappeared afterwards, and they put crazy KPIs that nobody could ever meet because they just wanted to get the project in and get their win fee and all of that. Now, like I said, we work with great consultants. I don't think that's a very common thing here, but you always have to, if it seems too good to be true, if they're saying, oh, I can write you projects and get you loads of money and you don't have to do anything, that's probably not a great idea. Make sure that you're forming a relationship with your grant writer and that you're working in partnership together. But yeah, absolutely. If you've identified an opportunity that you really think is worth investing in some extra capacity for, it makes total sense. So that was one
Okay.
thing. And
Yeah.
then there was the whether you need to bring in expertise. So like say
Professional input, yeah.
professional inputs, it depends on the type of grant. So if you're doing straightforward project grants, as in activity grants, so the kinds of grants that the wheel is going for, where it's about running training or doing research or whatever, you might not need to, we wouldn't necessarily need to bring in outside expertise. Sometimes we'll need to bring in expertise. So if we want to do a bit of research, we'd need to bring in a research partner with us to like help us conduct that, because we wouldn't necessarily have that capacity in-house. If you're applying for capital projects, like this seems to indicate, because they're talking about architects and stuff like that, so these are building projects, then yeah, absolutely, you need to work very closely with whatever the funder guides. So for example, if it's leader, the leader action groups will tell you what's expected in terms of quotes and pricing and investment at whatever time. But certainly I would be looking at, because usually it's to do with pricing is the main thing, or you might need a little bit of instruction for them in terms of how to write content. I would be engaging who it is you need to realize your project, so that you make sure you're including the right budget and that you're including the right kind of information that's needed. Like sometimes you need to have done a risk analysis and all kinds of stuff. So yeah, I would recommend that. But if it is, for example, leader or some other type of funder that provides funding for capital projects, really engage with them, because they will help you understand what it is you need to write your application. So I would always, particularly when it's something like that and it's a bit more complicated, I would always engage with the funder and kind of say, look, this is what we're thinking of doing. Is this in line with what you'll need for the application? And most funders are very helpful. They have a remit as well to fund good projects. So they're usually quite happy to work with you to help you understand what it is you need to provide and at what stage of the process.
Okay. Okay,
Yeah.
great. So let's take two more. There are more, but we have another round also afterwards. Here's one. Would you have any examples for KPI quality and projects for artistic activities?
Yeah. So it really depends on your project, but I would always, in terms of KPIs, I would always we often go for educational projects, say, because we're doing skills training or something for the sector. And it's kind of the same, whether it's arts or whether it's skills or whether it's whatever. There's the kind of quantitative data in terms of how many people are you going to reach. So that's very important to understand. So say you're going to have a arts outreach program and it's going to 50 people are going to take part, right? It can also be really good from a quantitative point of view to measure kind of, say if it's capacity or something like that. So we would measure the skills before and after the intervention. So we do a very quick survey, like how confident do you feel about governance or something in your organization? And they might rate themselves at a 3 out of 5. And then we'd repeat the survey afterwards and we'd be able to see, oh, okay, so capacity was increased as a result of our, maybe they're 5 out of 5 now or something like that. So you can do something. So maybe if it was an arts thing, it would be, I'm trying to think of an example, but I can't. So like, how confident do you feel in this medium in this artistic medium? Or, how would you have rated your participation with a group or something like that? Did you get something social out of it? Did you get something that has increased your well-being or your participation in your community or whatever? So it can be lots and lots. It doesn't have to be skills increase. It can be increased in self-perceived well-being or participation or any number of things. So you could do a quantitative analysis, and these can be really short surveys, like before and afterwards, to see your impact. And then I would always do a general kind of satisfaction one as well, in terms of, like, for example, we'd always ask people to rate the quality of the content and the trainers and the facilities, like, if it's an in-person course, Was the environment conducive for their learning? Were the materials sufficient? All that kind of stuff. So that you've got already a good few indicators there, and that's all the quantitative side. So you've got, and you can set yourself a goal. Like I usually go with 80% because I usually think that's quite safe. You know, even if you have one outlier or two outliers, you can 80%, if 80% of people are satisfied with the course that we ran, that's pretty good. Like we're happy with that, you know. So that's all your quantitative side. And then I would always do a few qualitative ones as well, where I'd
Yep.
maybe collect a few case studies or testimonials or a focus group or something like that. So you can do a little combination, quantitative and qualitative.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. I would just like have one more, which because this
Yeah.
is pretty often, and that combines a couple of questions we had. So
Okay.
the funding for salaries or for
Mm,
grants that pay for admin, for time, for wages, so to complete the goals and the projects, also for new hires.
mm,
That's like how to navigate that in an application, and
mhm.
project, the cost of course will go to the project itself, but like how is that possible to do that, or are there grants actually available to do this?
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's very few grants that will just pay for a person to do their job. Like that's unfortunately, and there's a big gap in the sector when it comes to that. And that's why grants are always there to innovate or to try something new. They're not there. And if you have enough grants, if you're running several projects at once, and each of them are making a little bit of a contribution to your bottom line and to, you know, your core, like, you know, they're making a bit of a contribution to overheads, they're making a bit of a contribution to the core staff that help to run your organization or whatever, then, you know, that can help it be sustainable. But in general, you shouldn't be treating grants as a way to fund the core work of your organization because they just don't work very well like that. You know, they're there, funders want to fund innovative project-based stuff. There are very few exceptions to this where, you know, they're not really projects then or grants. They're like CE schemes and operation grants, and then you can get contracts from government to run services. But when we're talking about grants specifically, they're there to do projects. So they can supplement and they can, you know, they can help contribute towards somebody's salary, or they can contribute towards the bottom line in your organization. But they're not gonna, there is no grant where it's like, we need an administrator or we need a CEO, and you know, how can we get a fund to cover that? It's just not how they work. So that's one important thing to bear in mind. And then I'm glad I added in the budget tips to the project because we'll actually get into
Okay.
how to calculate your budget. So we'll get to
Okay.
that bit right afterwards. Um, Go ahead if there's one more, is
Great.
there?
No, so there are a couple more, but we can go back to those
Okay,
after the second
great.
bit. Let's finish your second bit so we hear all the content, and then I've seen all the questions. I have a
Yeah.
list here, so we get back to those. No worries.
Great. Good stuff. Thank you very much, Christina. Okay, so using scoring criteria to your advantage. So this is another area where people tend to, and look, I do it as well. You write the project, you write it as it makes sense to you, and you respond to the questions and you write what you think is important. But the important thing is to go back and actually see, well, what did the funder want? Because most funders will provide scoring criteria for the overall grant, or even scoring criteria per question. Sometimes they might include that, but they'll say the vast majority of them will outline what it is they want to hear. And if it doesn't match with what you thought was interesting to talk about, you can potentially miss out on on points. So you really need to pay attention to scoring criteria. It's often kind of overlooked in the frenzy that happens around grants and deadlines and things like that. But it is important to allocate specific time to make sure that you're reaching the scoring criteria, or you're maximizing the scoring criteria. So these are the metrics that the funder uses to assess your application. You could include amazing details on something that's really interesting. If it's not in the scoring criteria, they can't really give you any points for it. So you potentially wasted some time there. So you have to make sure you're bringing it back to that. Sometimes they're weighted, sometimes not. It really depends on the funder, how much detail they give you. Usually the evaluator cannot award points outside of the criteria. So like I said, you could be wasting your time. The scoring criteria and the overall priorities. So usually funders will have a list of their priorities and then they'll have a list of the scoring criteria. They're there to help you. Sometimes people see them as a bit of a hindrance or like confusing or whatever, but if you read them closely, they're all hints. They're hints on what it is that they want to hear. So they're there to try and help you. So this is an example of some priorities this is an old call from the Community Foundation for Ireland, from the Toy Show appeal. So they say that their priorities are, they think this is going to be very competitive. So proposals that meet all the priorities of this grant round will be prioritised. So again, they're giving you a bit of a hint there, as in, if you've only got a little bit of a connection to one of them, don't waste your time. We're going to be inundated, and this is what we want to see. This is what we can give money towards, are these identified priorities. So they want something that's strongly justified based on research or feedback. So we touched on that earlier. They specifically are interested around around prevention and early intervention. So if you don't work in that particular area, if your project isn't to do with that, probably not that you probably shouldn't waste your time, even if you have a great idea, even if it would be really nice. It's not what they're looking for. So it's also about being able to allocate your resources and your time and your attention effectively as well. Projects that have a strong impact in the wider community as well as direct beneficiaries. So they do want to see you not just being like, oh, we'll go into this community centre and we'll deliver this program for kids. They want to see how you're going to engage stakeholders and how you're going to have a wider impact. So you'd have to mention that in your project. Projects that have potential to be sustained beyond the lifetime of this grant. So this, again, is a really challenging area. Most of the way that you can do sustainability is by building in sustainability throughout the project. So building in a sustainability work package and working on that as part of the project, but also making sure that you're creating things that can be absorbed within, like once they exist. So for example, when the wheel creates courses and materials and stuff like that, the expensive, difficult bit is creating the thing. Once it's created, it can be absorbed into our everyday skills offering. So that's how we sustain it. So yeah, thinking about how not creating anything that is going to die a death once the funding dries up. It needs to be something that can be mainstream, that can be absorbed by the organisation once it's created. Projects that will include the voice and feedback of beneficiaries in its development. So they want to see how you've involved beneficiaries in the development of your idea and your project. So they've said very specifically what they need. And if you want to maximise points, I would have my list and I would go through my application and I would be ticking. And if I haven't ticked one, I'd go back and I write it in to make sure that I'm ticking. So you need to, not neglect these types of things. So here's just if I was to go through it and highlight the important words so that I can compare it later to my application, I need to make sure I'm strongly justifying. I need to make sure I'm mentioning the research and feedback. I need to emphasize the prevention and early intervention aspect of the project. I need to have a specific heading about impact on the wider community and analysis or a description of how I'm going to do that. I need to demonstrate and make sure, even whether they ask me or not, because sometimes the way they design the questions doesn't match with their priorities. So whether they've asked me about sustainability or not, I'm finding some way to include it in the application because it's in their priority. So I want to make sure I can tick that box. And then I need to have a description of how the voice and feedback of beneficiaries was part of the development of the project. So ensure that you're specifically addressing what they are looking for and don't be subtle. Sometimes people think, oh, I did mention it. Look, there's this big long sentence there and right in the middle of it, I mentioned that word. They're reading hundreds of these projects. You have to beat them over the head with it, make it really clear that you are addressing. Don't be subtle, make it widely. If you have to put headlines or headings and bullet points, put things in bold if you can, depends on the application portal, try and make sure that it's not subtle, it cannot be missed. If it's not reflected in the questions, insert it anyway. So for example, if they didn't have that question on sustainability, I would find some way of shoehorning it into the application. Review your application at the end against the criteria. Did you hit every point? When it comes to maximising points to answer questions, remember, each question is an opportunity to make your case to the funder. A common mistake that people make when writing grants is either not answering the question at all or not answering it fully. So I review a lot of grants through our work at the Wheel, and the amount of times like people go and they give lovely answers, very, very detailed, very well written answers, but it wasn't what they were asked, so again, you can't give any points for that, even if it's a great answer. If it doesn't actually answer the question, or if it only answers part of the question, you're halving the points that you can potentially get. This in our previous training, we do talk about, and it was one of the things that came up in the word cloud about good practice in writing and vocabulary and wording and stuff like that. So I do have, if you want to look at the previous training, which is linked there, things around using assertive language, using the active voice. I touch on that in that last training. I won't repeat it here, but it's useful and you can check it out. Another thing that I talk about sometimes in these trainings, but this is like, I still do this, I will always do this when writing, when answering questions, particularly long, complicated grant questions, is to use this kind of keyword method. So this is a really good way of breaking it down. We're going to look at an example now. So this is a real question from an EU funded application. Sometimes people look at these and they think, oh my God, like no wonder, and I get it, like no wonder the EU has a bad reputation for inaccessibility and wordiness and difficult applications, because they see this big, huge, long question and they're like, oh, for God's sake. But in actuality, like they are trying to be helpful. They're not just asking you one question. Like sometimes they just say, tell us about your project, like some funders, tell us about your project. And it's like, well, you know, and you have 50 words or something like that. Like that's not actually very helpful. They're actually being helpful here because they're not just giving you the question, they're also breaking down exactly what it is that they want to see. So the question is, it's under communication, dissemination, and visibility of funding. Describe the communication activities which are planned in order to promote the activities' results, maximize impact. Clarify who you will reach, how you will reach the target groups, relevant stakeholders, policy makers, and the general public, and explain the choice of dissemination channels, and describe how the visibility of EU funding will be ensured. So there's about 4, maybe 5 questions within that one question, which I know can be very frustrating, but it's also, you can use it as an opportunity to help. So what you would do is you would always break down a question like this, and you would use this keyword method to highlight what are the key points I need to hit upon to maximize my points for this question and to make it as structured as possible so that the evaluator cannot possibly miss that I have ticked all the boxes. So you don't just want to make sure you've ticked all the boxes, you want to make sure that it is inescapable, that, you know, that the evaluator can't say, oh, well, they didn't really answer that question, because you did, and you made it very, very clear. So in terms of keyword method, this is what I would do anyway. I would say, right, communication dissemination activities. That's one thing they want me to describe. Then they want to say, how am I going to use those to maximize the impact? Then they want me to clarify how I will reach my target groups and what dissemination channels they want me to reach. And then finally, they want me to talk about visibility of EU funding. So if I hit all of those points, I will have maximized my points for this question. And this is an example. I actually use a slightly different project, but it's another sporty kind of project. So my target groups, I might have my primary target groups, and they're my beneficiaries. So coaches and young people with fewer opportunities, age 12 to 17 in this fictional example. But my secondary ones, the other people who can also help me reach my goals with this project, could be other sports organizations. Multipliers are people who can, this is EU speak, but you don't have to use it. But multipliers are people who can help amplify your message. So, you know, other sports organizations or other agencies that are interested in this target group and could take your project and bring it further and help to spread the word. Policymakers, regional and national sports bodies, things like that. The communication channels that I would use, there might be online ones, face-to-face ones, and using multipliers, as I said, for example, stakeholder networks at national and EU level who can help you spread the word. So you'll set target groups for this. So online, you'll have your social media and stuff like that. Your target group is maybe your primary target group. Your face-to-face stuff, maybe you're focusing on your secondary target group, and your multipliers will include, you know, 5 different network bodies or something like that. And you'll talk about, explain the combined network of the partners and what channels. So like if you're partnering with the Wheel, for instance, I'd be like, well, we have this many online followers, we run 150 events a year, and we reach this many people, and we have this kind of a network. So you gather all of that together from all your partners and stakeholders, and that's how you talk about your activities. Then your impact. So in this, you describe what the goal of your dissemination it is, what difference it will make. So for example, dissemination is really good for helping to mainstream project outputs and results, and share learnings and gather feedback for further project development. So that's how we'd use dissemination in our projects. We've created something that we want to share with others, and they can use now and they can adapt. So that's the mainstreaming. We want to share those learnings and we want to gather feedback so that if we do decide to apply for a subsequent project, a follow-on project, we have some feedback to operate off. How many people will you reach? Who will measure and report on impact? So for example, if you're in a partnership, you might have one partner who's in charge of dissemination, and they'll be in charge of monitoring the dissemination throughout the project and making sure you're reaching your goals. And you might, if you want, include, like, so for here, we might say our comms manager, my colleague Gert, would be in charge of monitoring dissemination. So I might include a few lines about Gert there to show that he's a communications professional and he has experience and he'll do a great job doing this. And then visibility of EU funding. This is just an EU example, you know, adapt for other funders, obviously, but acknowledgement of EU funding will be highlighted in all project communications in line with the funder requirements. Partner in charge of dissemination, so maybe Gert at the wheel, will ensure that this is implemented and monitored throughout the project. So you can see that all the red things, all the key words became titles, became headings. And I would always, there's no, like I said, this isn't a science, it's an art. I prefer headings and bullet points because I think it makes it inescapable that you have actually ticked the boxes and addressed the questions. You know, it's much harder for the funder, for the evaluator to miss it, as opposed to if you have everything but it's in a wall of text and it's in there somewhere, but they have to, it's harder for them to see. So I think this makes it easier to read, easier for them to tick off the evaluation criteria that you've done what you've said you're gonna do. There is still bits of text where you'll do more writing, but in as much as possible, you're using headings and bullet points and stuff like that to make it more accessible for them. So this is an example. That's a pretty complicated project question, and EU funding is, their applications are some of the tougher ones. But you know, you can see how you might adapt that for other types of funders and things like that, and hopefully it would be a bit easier for other types of funders. So that's your keyword method, which is really handy for breaking down complicated questions and maximizing that scoring criteria. Makes it easier for you as well when you're reviewing at the end to see that you did in fact tick all the boxes. When it comes to designing budgets, I added this in at the last minute, so I just have to be careful of time, but this is quite, there's no way of making this engaging. It's just maths. So budget categories. So you have things like your personnel costs. So a lot of time people are like, well, how do I calculate that kind of thing? I like to work with daily rates for personnel costs that just make it easier for me. So I can kind of easily kind of guesstimate how many days somebody might spend working on the project. But how you calculate your personnel cost, it's your salary plus your PRSI plus your pension plus any other pension contributions that the employer makes, plus any other costs incurred by the employer for hiring that person. In Ireland, it is usually salary, PRSI, and pension. But if you're working with EU partners, there might be other costs, other taxes, and things like that. So that's your personnel costs. Is that's how much it costs to employ that person for the year. And then if you want to find out what the daily rate for that person is, which I find easier to work with, some people work in person months, which is like how much it costs to hire that person for a month, or for that person to work for a month. I don't know. I just find daily rates easier to work with because it's a smaller unit. It's just your personnel costs divided by the number of working days in a year. So that's working days as in, depending if you work 5 days a week. So that minus your annual leave entitlement, because they're obviously not at work when they're on annual leave, minus public holidays, plus minus any other paid time off. So funders might impose limits. They might say we're not funding anything over a certain amount, or when you add up all of that, it can look a bit ridiculously expensive depending on the funder. That's the actual daily rate. That's actually how much it costs to have somebody at work for a day. Is your personnel cost divided by number of actual working days in a year. But I might kind of, depending on the funder, depending on how expensive it looks, be like, I won't, you know, I'll just do daily rates or salary yearly costs divided by overall working days per year. I won't take off annual leave or public holidays or whatever, just because it also has to look reasonable and fair to the funder as well. So, but be aware, this is just, if you're basing it completely on actual costs, this is how you go about calculating it. This is the correct way to calculate it. But funders might impose limits. They might be saying, oh, we're not doing salary costs over a certain amount, or salary costs are capped at a certain amount, or whatever. So you have to work within their limits as well. For travel and I'm covering all the usual budget categories, by the way. So there's personnel costs, there's travel and subsistence. You might have an internal policy of how you do travel and subsistence in your organization, or sometimes people use the civil service rates as an indicator, or if you're doing EU grants, there's a calculator for calculating your costs to do with travel and stuff like that. So it depends on the grant, it depends on depends on your own internal policies and who you're applying to. But yeah, travel and subsistence is generally, and you might not need it for every project, completely depends, but if you do need it, that's the general guidelines of how to do it. Equipment and depreciation depends on the grant. You very rarely get depreciation costs now, but you might get some equipment costs if you need to hire somebody, or it depends on the project. You know, maybe some of you work more with equipment. We don't. So, but yeah, it's in terms of depreciation, it's usually cost minus residual value divided by useful life. Again, that's not one that I use very often, so I don't know about it as much. Consumables and supplies. So this is, you know, your typical costs. So for example, the wheel runs a lot of trainings and events. So I just know how much it costs to run an event in Dublin for 50 people or 100 people. And if it's a half day event or a full day event, like you just kind of have a list of that kind of stuff. If you know, if you run lots of workshops or something, have an idea of how much is your venue rental, how much is your materials and supplies, how much is your, if you need to do catering or something like that. So you should have a kind of typical list of consumables and supplies that you might use in everyday projects so that you can refer to them. Subcontracting is also generally a typical category in grants. Which it can be perfectly fine. You might subcontract out that you've got like somebody to do videos, or somebody to do graphic design, or somebody to do a website, or something like that. So there's nothing wrong with subcontracting. You do just have to be careful to justify it. And particularly if your subcontracting rates look kind of weirdly high, they can be taken a bit aback, where they're like, well, hold on now, we want to give you the money. We're not giving this other organization that isn't even vetted and isn't in the project money. So if you've got high subcontracting rates for any reason, you'll have to be very careful to justify that in your application, and know that it can be a little bit of a risk, because in their mind, that's an unvetted other party that they, you know, that's not who they're trying to give their money to. They're trying to give it to an organization like yours. So you just have to be careful with subcontracting. And overheads, if they're allowed, not all funders will allow overheads, but if they are allowed, sometimes they'll set them, like, so they'll have a limit, which is between 7 and 12% often, depends on the funder. I think the EU does 7% a lot, so that's probably where I got that from, but I've seen them as high as 12%. So yeah, but they're generally your budget categories. You've got personnel, personnel, travel and subsistence, equipment and depreciation, consumables and supplies, subcontracting, and overheads. Can completely depend on the grant. If you're going for a big capital grant, for instance, which is something I've never done because I've never worked in that type of an organization, it might be completely different. But for your standard activity-based projects, this is the kind of categories that you're looking at. In terms of general advice, hurry up a bit, I'm almost done. Will be competitive, but do not consistently undercut yourself. So it's always a call. Like, sometimes our daily rates look fine, other times it looks too high for the amount of funding. So I have to kind of, you know, make it work, basically. It really depends. You just, but obviously you can't consistently go for projects that are going to undercut yourself and cost you money. So for everything, you know, you need to have a balance. It needs to be sustainable and financially tenable. But you know, but at the same time, it has to, if you're committed to going for something, you really want this funding, you may have to be flexible. Costs should be reasonable and justified. There shouldn't be some random really high cost there that isn't explained. Like, for example, subcontracting, that is kind of a red flag to funders. And even if you do justify it, if it doesn't fit in with what they want to do, you might not get it. So you have to be careful about random high costs. Even if they're justified, it might not wash. Use their budget format and follow their rules. You might have your own internal system for calculating it, but make sure you adhere to their rules ultimately. Pay attention to match funding and co-financing requirements. Sometimes funders will expect you to provide 10% or 20% or even 40% in some rare instances of they want you to match fund or to co-finance, depends on the vocabulary they use. So this can be prohibitive for some organizations. You have to know what you can absorb and what you can't. And sometimes, for example, the EU will sometimes allow you to count volunteer hours towards your match fund, your co-financing or overheads or whatever. Whereas if it's an actual cash, like if you're supposed to demonstrate cash, like that can be much more difficult for organizations to weather. So just make sure that you fully understand the match fund or co-financing requirements and compare the budget to the size of to the budget size and the impact you've described. Does it match in sales? So you might do your full budget, but like if you're reaching 50 people and it's a 150,000 project or something like that, you have to be reasonable in terms of like, does this look like value for money for the impact that I'm saying I'm going to deliver? So that's kind of a judgment call that you have to make. And this is something, I'm aware that all this budget stuff might seem very complicated if you're completely new to this kind of things. Just take it one at a time. Like nobody knows how to do budgets when they start writing grants. Like most of us who are writing grants come from a writing type background like me. So I like the writing bit. I hate the maths bit, but unfortunately it's part of my job, but I have to do it. But I've gotten confident with it as time goes on. So you don't go in immediately understanding everything about budgets. You start one at a time and you kind of crack each system as it goes. And it's actually not that complicated. Even for somebody who absolutely abhors maths like me, I've begrudgingly realized actually it's not that bad. It's easy enough, and it's mainly adding and subtracting, so we can do that. Very quickly, and then we will have a few minutes for some last questions. Supports are available. We do have Funding Point, which is a newsletter. It is a subscription service, although you can get discounts of it. You can reach out to my colleagues in our membership team if you're interested in this. But this analyzes all the grant opportunities that are out there and puts them in one handy newsletter to save you an awful lot of research and monitoring and potentially missing out on opportunities. So if you're interested, subscribe to Funding Point. We also have Access Europe, which Christina mentioned earlier. This is our EU funding support service. So if you're in any way interested in anything to do with EU funding, reach out to Access Europe, whether you're interested in finding out about opportunities. There's a newsletter, again, that one's free, and there's an EU funding guide and all of that stuff. But we can help you through that process of kind of cracking EU funding. It's one of those things where you might need a lot of help at the beginning, but then eventually, it becomes kind of a core part of your organization, and it becomes this new avenue of funding. So it's a really good investment if you're interested in EU funding, and Access Europe is there to help. And then we have other supports. We have things on our website, like we have a funding hub and things like that, and other information. We do lots of funding training related events. So for example, there's one next week. I'll be in Sligo on the 4th of November. This is for the Wheel Roadshow. We'll be talking about all kinds of supports that we offer, but we'll touch on funding as well. And we'll be there if people want to come up and chat to us and ask questions. So if you happen to be near Sligo on the 4th of November, you're very welcome to come along. But that is most of it in terms of supports and services. So I can kind of rushed a bit there. Oh, I see somebody saying that Funding Point is so helpful. So that's great.
Yeah, great service.
So that's brilliant. Is there any other questions, Christina?
Yeah. Yes, so you covered all the travel costs and calories. This was great because there were some around travel expenses, but I think now everyone knows what actually you can cover with EU funding. It's a very quick question, I think. Is there space in the grant proposal to talk about your previous work? Yes, so definitely you can present yourself, your organization, your work, because they actually want to know who you are, right?
Yeah, it depends on the application, but absolutely, even if they don't ask you, about past projects, if they ask you about your organization, absolutely put in a couple of examples of previous stuff that you've done, because that's very reassuring to the funder that like, oh, right, these people are experienced, they know what they're doing, kind of. So yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. So, and then the using AI question. So for example, ChatGPT. So do you know around this topic? So do you have a sense of how funders feel about this? Any tips and tricks using it in a smart way? Have you had some experience with that?
Yeah.
Do you know if they check the proposals, if they do
Yeah.
like an AI detector? I could actually imagine that they do that at this point, right?
It depends. Yeah, I've seen a couple of them where they've specifically asked you to declare if you used AI or not, which was interesting. It's all very new, obviously. So I think funders are also kind of trying to catch up with it. I would always say, and I've kind of played around with it a good bit, it can be very useful for things like word counts, because
Yeah,
that can be like, that's basically the only
yeah.
thing that I use. Like, because I often do this stream of consciousness, like they say, tell me about this, and you have like 10 words or something like that. But and if you get caught up in that when you're in your writing phase, you're going to interrupt your flow. So I just answer the questions, and then sometimes I would use it to try and reduce it down if I was struggling to get it down, particularly because when it's your own writing, it can be hard to edit because you're like, oh, I spent so long on that paragraph and now I just have to delete it. So sometimes I think it can be useful for word counts, but I would still be really careful, as in if I do resort to it for word counts, I still read it very closely, make sure it's exactly what I said. I would erase any kind of
Mm,
telltale AI stuff, like often
yeah.
those M rules, those long dashes. I just
Yes,
think
the
it
long
looks bad.
dashes.
Even though as a grammar nerd, M dashes used to be great, but anyway, I
Oh,
can't have them anymore.
that's
So
over. That's over now, Emma.
AI took them, so we're not allowed them
Yeah, I
anymore.
took them.
Yeah, I would take away any telltale signs. If you're getting sources from ChatGPT, know that that is visible in the URL that it came from
Yeah,
ChatGPT. So I wouldn't do that. I think it's useful for arbitrary, ridiculous, and infuriating word counts that make grant writing such a pain. As long as you check it and edit it still and make sure that the meaning is still in there. Sometimes I've used it to like jog my inspiration when it comes to like a question. I ask it, what would you say to this? I don't think I've ever used its answer, but it gives me something to disagree with. So suddenly
hmm,
I'm like, no, that's wrong. And I go and
yeah,
write my answer anyway, kind of. But it kind of helps me to get the flow. It's kind of something to bounce stuff off of, but I would be really careful. Like it has to start with your writing and it has to be heavily reviewed. And if the funder rules it out, don't use it because they can probably tell.
yeah.
I don't know how they tell exactly, but I
Oh,
feel like they can.
there are
So
these AI detectors, and they are pretty
yeah.
good. So they tell you to which
Mhm.
percentage actually your text is human or
Yeah.
AI, and
Yeah.
that like that it's like a second to
Yeah.
detect.
Yeah.
So I
So
wouldn't rely on that.
no, no.
Yeah. So a question on including social return on investment within the
Mm,
project impact outcomes. Any thoughts on
yeah.
that?
If you've done a social return on investment study in on your services or a particular program that you run, for the love of God, mention that because that's great. Because that is, I've seen social, like in general, proper social return on investment studies are pretty expensive and very laborious and intense to run. So if you've invested in that and you have that, that's great. And you should definitely mention that in your proposals because it adds great weight to what you're saying and to the value of what you're
Mm,
presenting. I think if you were to try and include them as an output to do a proper SROI, like I'm thinking of what Quality Matters, who are kind of stakeholders, partners of the wheel, they do these types of studies. To include that as part of a project, I think would be really tough, but maybe that's me
mhm.
just not knowing enough about it. As far as I can see, it's a very intensive, very expensive process. So I would look to bring in a partner who could do it rather than subcontract it out or something like that.
Got it.
And make sure that they were part of the design and that the SROI was built in, because if you try and do it after the fact and promise that you're going to do it and then it becomes too expensive or too it's going to take too long, or it's, it wasn't your intervention doesn't really fit with an SROI, like I don't know, I just think that would be a little bit risky. So if you've done it and you can refer to it in your application, brilliant. Um, Adding it in as a project activity, I would consult with an SROI person first to make sure that that's realistic.
Yeah,
Um,
that makes
yeah,
sense.
yeah.
Totally. Here's another very interesting question actually about the internal review process and how to navigate that. So you write it all down, but then
Mhm.
the organization review the application and they edit too much and end up like underlining the language, whatever. So do you have
Uh,
like do you
hate
have any
people like
experience?
that. Um, okay, so this is within the organization, obviously. That's
Yes, yes.
okay. So I think that in general, grants by committee are a kind of a bad idea.
Yeah.
Absolutely. In the last training, I talk about a project development process, which there's 7 steps for ensuring that you're getting sign off and buy-in from the right people and that everybody's kind of on board with what it is that you're proposing. So I would definitely do that process because absolutely it's important to get the buy-in from people, whether it's your senior management or your board or whatever. But at that point, then, I would kind of say, look, there is one grant writer here. Absolutely, people can review and they can add some comments or ideas, but it's really not fair on the person trying to coordinate the process if they're rewriting everything and then you have to redo your word counts and you have to potentially rejig things so that it fits in with the question. Like if you're the person who's responsible for the grant writing in the organization, you need to be trusted to do your job properly. So absolutely people can review and add questions, but the final say goes for you. Very rarely do I even ask people to review anymore, but when I do, I am maniacal about like word count, don't add anything unless it's absolutely essential. Add things in comments and track changes. You're not allowed to just change the text, because it's going to just water down the quality. It's going to look like 10 different people wrote it and that it's a bit of a mess.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but that's my massive bias as well because I hate when people do that. So maybe there's a more diplomatic response, but it's probably not going to come from me. So
Totally, thanks for this answer. Quick question, how can you quantify volunteer costs for the budget income?
mm, it depends. So you
Mm.
really need to go by the funder because this is a relatively new development in some
Mm.
projects that they've started to be like, oh yeah, you can count volunteer. So for example, if you're applying to anything from Lergus, the National Agency for Erasmus Plus, I know they've started doing it. Usually, like as a base, if they provided no guidance whatsoever, I would go with minimum wage by hours. That's what I would
Okay.
go with. But you really should check with the funder. So if
Yeah.
you've seen that and you're going to try and do that, I would contact the funder. If they don't mention it at all about whether you can count, I would ask the question, can we count volunteer hours as our in-kind contribution or to demonstrate the extra value that we're going to add to the grant? And then number two, if we can count it, how would you like us to calculate it? If they don't give you any guidance on how to calculate it, minimum wage by hours, I would say.
Okay, great. So the very last one, because we're over time, can you please share more ideas about including sustainability in your application? I know this is a
Mm,
whole topic, and I think we also
yeah,
want a training on that, but maybe
yeah.
just very quickly, some thoughts on that?
Yeah, so this would be the sustainability of the outputs, I assume, as opposed to environmental sustainability overall. So I'm going to answer it
Mm.
based on sustainability of the outputs. This is a really tricky question. It's something that comes up a lot. Ultimately, you will never have any perfect solution to sustainability of grant outcomes because the whole point is it's project based and the funding is going to end. Um,
Mhm.
if it's a large project where we're talking about, like if it's something small where you can easily absorb it into your everyday work, post funding, that's one thing. If it's, so for example, we do a lot of EU projects where we're producing courses and research and stuff like that. Um, I always build in a sustainability work package so that we're actually working on it for the whole output of the project and that one of the outputs of the project itself is a sustainability plan. So this might include well, first of all, how are we going to absorb the outputs into our everyday work so that things don't just die? So there's the kind of sustainability in that sense of just keeping things alive.
Mm.
And that might mean as well not designing outputs that are too big for you to sustain. It's one thing, like you could get funding to do a big, huge, fancy platform or learning platform or something. If you can't afford to sustain it afterwards, you really have to ask the question of whether you should do this or whether you should design your project to be more sustainable from the offset, something that you can absorb. So there's the stuff that you can absorb in, and then there's the stuff that you can kind of capitalize on and further grow. And a sustainability plan might include identifications of funders that could provide ongoing support,
Sure.
opportunities for further grants to further grow it and innovate. So yeah, you've got to think about mainstreaming and absorption and then capitalizing and further growth. And you kind of build a plan for both of those things into the project. But it's not a
Okay.
perfect, it's always going to be a little bit haphazard.
Okay.
Um, yeah.
Perfect. Thanks a
Okay.
lot, Emma. I think that
Okay.
was it. I hope I covered all the questions. Thanks for being
Yep.
for asking all these questions, for staying with us. That was excellent content shared. As I mentioned, we will share this recording and all slides. You will receive all the links. I just share very quickly some slides. So for the follow-up support that we are offering here at Access Europe, but that was also already mentioned by Emma. So we have our website, accesseurope.ie. You can write to us via europe@wheel.ie. We have a monthly newsletter, including all the EU funding programs, deadlines, and so forth. We have trainings, events like this. We also offer one-on-one advice. So just reach out to us, and you also can follow us on LinkedIn. And also I would recommend that, especially at the moment, because currently we have the our EU Story Awards running, and there's a deadline on the 31st of October. So this Friday. This is actually for already funded EU projects. So if you have a funded EU project, you can upload a short video, fill out a registration form, and then you can win a cash prize. If you go to our website, accesseurope.ie/oureustory, you will learn more about this competition that is going on at the moment. And the winners will actually be announced at the Access Europe Showcase on 27th of November. I shared the link there in the chat. So join us in Dublin for this event, the showcase, which is around EU funding, success stories, lots of national contact points will be there and so forth. And then I'm supposed to share also this, but maybe Emma, you know more about that.
Yeah, just to say, if you're not a member of the wheel, remember that it's free for organizations under 25,000 euro turnover, and it's scaled from there in terms of to try and make it as affordable. And look, there's loads and loads of benefits, including one-to-one meetings if you need advice, access. We've got loads of really useful policy templates and things like that, so that you don't have to try and reinvent things. You can use our ones. We have member networks, deals, discounts on training, all kinds of stuff. So check out that if you're interested, and you can scan the QR code if you want to find out more.
Exactly, or just on wheel.ie on the website. So
Yeah.
I think that's it, right?
Only 7 minutes over. That's really good.
Wow, that's the new record.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Christina.
Thanks a lot, Emma. Thanks to everyone who attended. If there's anything, reach out to us via Europe and I also shared my email in the chat. I've seen already that some wrote to me because you wanted to have like the list of grant writers. So we will share that afterwards. Thanks all, and have a beautiful rest of the day.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.